Hey guys, I hope you're all well. So in today's lecture, we're going to recap the physiology of the autonomic nervous system. So this topic is very important in understanding the effects of the different drugs affecting the autonomic nervous system. So if you want to know the different drugs, for example, the cholinergic and adrenergic agonists and antagonists, please do not skip this one. You have to nail and understand the physiology first before understanding the pharmacology. Okay, so today's learning objectives include comparing and contrasting the sympathetic and parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, as well as reviewing the effects of autonomic activity on different organ systems. Right, in case you guys have forgotten from physiology, the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system includes everything else that's not the brain and the spinal cord. So those are the nerves in the periphery, okay? So the peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system primarily deals with voluntary actions of the skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system deals with the involuntary or the automatic actions, okay? So the autonomic nervous system is divided into two, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, as you might have heard before, it's the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system generates the rest and digest response. Okay, so now let's compare the somatic motor neurons and the autonomic motor neurons. So motor neurons just mean the efferent neurons, and that means the neurons that send signal from the brain and the spinal cord to the effector, muscle, gland, tissue, whatever, okay? So as you can see here in the somatic nervous system, there's only one somatic motor neuron that runs from the brain or spinal cord to the effector muscle, such as the skeletal muscle. Okay, so to compare that with the autonomic nervous system, the motor neurons here, you could actually see that it's divided into two. So here we have a preganglionic motor neuron, which is myelinated, and a postganglionic motor neuron, which is unmyelinated. So instead of just one long neuron, we divide them into two. So you might be wondering what a ganglion is. So a ganglion basically just means a collection of cell body that's in the periphery, okay? So don't be confused. So basically the thing that I want you to get from this slide is that in the somatic nervous system, there's only one long neuron, which is myelinated, that goes from the spinal cord to the effector muscle, which is usually the skeletal muscle. And in the autonomic nervous system, it's divided into two. So we have the preganglionic and the postganglionic neuron. Okay, so now to compare the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, as we can see here, in the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron is actually longer than the postganglionic neuron. So the opposite is true for the sympathetic nervous system. So in the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron is usually shorter, well, it's always shorter than the postganglionic neuron, okay? And then another difference is the neurotransmitter released. So for both of them, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, the neurotransmitter released between the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons are acetylcholine molecules. But then in the parasympathetic nervous system, the neurotransmitter released between the postganglionic neuron and the target organ, it's acetylcholine. And in the sympathetic nervous system, it's norepinephrine. Okay, to note the other differences in between the two, the postganglionic neuron, the soma, so the cell body of the postganglionic neuron in the parasympathetic nervous system, is usually located near the target organ. But in the sympathetic nervous system, the soma, or the cell body of the postganglionic neuron, is usually located next or close to the spinal cord. Okay, so in this slide, we can see again the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. So in So all nerves originate from the CNS, so the brainstem or the spinal cord, okay? So the preganglionic cell bodies of the sympathetic nervous system, they come out from T1 to L2 as shown here in green. So this region is called the thoracolumbar region. That's why the sympathetic nervous system is called the thoracolumbar outflow. Whereas the parasympathetic system here, if you look on this side, the preganglionic cell bodies of the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, they actually come out from cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, 10, and sacral nerves S2, S3, and S4. So this is referred to as the craniosacral region or the craniosacral outflow. So to add on to that, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, they generally control the same effector organs, but have opposing effects. The exception is the vasculature and the liver, which are exclusively controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. Actually, that's kind of a lie, okay? Most arteries and veins in our bodies are innervated by sympathetic adrenergic nerves, but some are also innervated by parasympathetic cholinergic nerves. Alright guys, so now let's actually discuss the effects of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system on different organ systems in the body. Okay, so the easiest way to memorize or remember the different effects is to just keep in mind that the sympathetic nervous system is the fight and flight response, whereas the parasympathetic system is the rest and digest response. So just keep those in mind while we discuss the different effects of these two systems on different organs in the body. Right, so firstly, let's start with the eyes. So in the eyes, we have the pupils, obviously. So during the sympathetic response, our pupils, they dilate, okay? And during the parasympathetic response, our pupils, they constrict. So the muscles responsible for this is actually called sphincter pupillae, also called circular muscles or constrictor pupillae. So during the parasympathetic response, as I said, those sphincter pupillae, they contract, causing pupillary constriction or meiosis. I'm throwing these words at you because you're gonna hear this a lot when we discuss ANS drugs. So parasympathetic nervous system, the effect on the pupillary muscles, the sphincter pupillae, they contract them, causing meiosis, okay? There's also another important muscle in the eye that I should mention here. They are called the ciliary muscles. So the ciliary muscles are the muscles that control the shape of the lens. So during the sympathetic response, those ciliary muscles, they relax or they dilate, leading to the loss of accommodation. Whereas in the parasympathetic response, those ciliary muscles, they contract, causing accommodation of focus for near vision, which is also called cyclospasm. So again, the parasympathetic response is that the ciliary muscles are contracted, causing cyclospasm, whereas in the sympathetic response, the ciliary muscles, they relax, causing cycloplegia. So the response here is cycloplegic, here it's cyclospastic. Moving on to the heart, during the sympathetic response, obviously it increases the heart rate. So there's two things here, guys. So heart rate and contractility, which is the actual force of contraction. So if I'm running away from a lion, for example, obviously I would want my heart to beat faster and the force of contraction to be greater. So I have adequate supply of blood to the muscles that are working when I'm fleeing away from a predator. So in contrast with the parasympathetic response, the heart rate and the contractility, they both decrease. Moving on to the airways, most specifically we're talking about the bronchioles here. So the bronchial smooth muscles actually. So during the sympathetic response, the bronchial muscles, the bronchial tubules, they dilate. and during the parasympathetic response, the bronchioles, they constrict. So why is that? Why is constriction here and why dilation here? Which, you know, from the surface, it sounds really confusing, but if you think about it, let's go back to fight and flight. If you're running away from a lion or a tiger or something scary, you'd want your bronchioles to dilate, to allow more air in, to allow more oxygen in, and to allow more carbon dioxide to be excreted, right? But, you know, when you're resting and digesting, it really doesn't matter so much. Right, moving on to the next one, the sweat glands. So during parasympathetic response, the sweat glands, they are stimulated. So that means that the production and secretion of sweat increases. As I said, I don't know if I said this earlier, the sweat glands are exclusively innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. There's also one more thing that I should add here. So, you know, in our skin, we have these smooth muscles called pilomotor smooth muscles. So during the sympathetic response, those smooth muscles, they contract. So, you know, when you get goosebumps, your hair kind of like rises and you get goosebumps. So that's your pilomotor muscles contracting. So that's, again, a sympathetic response. So moving on, our liver here. I said this earlier, I think. Again, the liver is just innervated by sympathetic nerves. So when the sympathetic nervous system is triggered, the liver then increases the rate of glycogenolysis. So glycogenolysis is basically just the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. So again, if we think back to fight or flight, this is really, really important, because when we're fleeing away from a lion, then we would want our body to have adequate energy to do so. So we get our energy primarily from glucose, and glucose primarily from the breakdown of glycogen, of stored glycogen. The atrial response is not actually relevant when we discuss the ANS drugs, so I'm just going to skip that one. Adrenal glands, obviously, during the sympathetic response, we up or we increase the production of adrenaline. So moving on to the urinary system. So there's two things to this, guys. So during parasympathetic response, the actual smooth muscle wall of the bladder, it actually relaxes, right? But the sphincter muscle, it constricts, holding the urine in. So the overall response is that it decreases our urgency to urinate. So the parasympathetic response is just the opposite. So the smooth muscles of the bladder, they contract, and the sphincter muscles, they relax, facilitating urination. So that increases our urgency to urinate. So as I said from the previous slide, our blood vessels are mainly innervated by the sympathetic nervous system, but some are innervated by the parasympathetic system. So the blood flow, so the blood vessels to the splanchnic vessels, which is like the digestive system, during the sympathetic response. So the blood vessels going to the splanchnic organs, they constrict during sympathetic response, because we don't want our digestive system to be active. You know, they don't need a lot of blood supply during fight or flight when we're running away from a lion. But you know, the opposite is true again for parasympathetic. So when we're resting and digesting, the blood vessels to the splanchnic vessels, they dilate, obviously increasing the blood flow to our splanchnic organs. And then during the sympathetic response, the blood flow to our skeletal muscles, we want that to be increased. So what we do is we dilate those vessels during sympathetic response to allow more blood to flow into those active muscles. So I hope that made sense. I hope I didn't confuse you so much. please watch my other videos. In my other videos, I talk about the cholinergic and adrenergic receptors, the different types and differences between the two, the different types of cell signaling, and different types of autonomic nervous system drugs. So thank you for watching, and I hope I see you in my next video.